two very eminent scholars on China. We are going to deliberate on the issue of COVID and fault lines in world politics. And it is a very good occasion to hear two eminent scholars speak on this to enlighten us. I hope we'll be having a very fruitful academic engagement in this webinar. May I now request Dr. Beam to introduce the speaker as well as the discussion of today's webinar, Dr. Zebin, and he may take over the rest of the proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Swan, and good afternoon, everyone. And although this was like initially we thought of doing it, but suddenly Professor Manjari Kaju, like our outgoing head, really, tickled me that this should happen and start here. So, and what better person and intellectual than to invite Professor Monti to begin with, and being an eminent scholar of political science and China studies, we are much indebted to him. So just to begin with, Professor Manoranjan Monti is a teacher, researcher, and writer, a political scientist, China scholar, and peace and human rights activist. And he has many books, research papers, theoretical and as well as empirical dimensions of social movement, human rights, development studies, and global transformation. So after retiring from University of Delhi, and he has been distinguished professor and present vice president of Council for Social Development and editor of the journal Social Change, published by SAGE. And he is also the former chairperson of Institute of Chinese Studies. And also apart from that, he has been one of the institution builder in India with regard to institutions everywhere, like to say ICS one of them, and also Development Research Center at Delhi University, and also Gaveshana Chakra and Development Research Institute in Orissa. And he has been also part of People's Union for Democratic Rights in Delhi and Pakistan's India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy since its inception. So he was part of the founding process of the Forum for Asia in China and RIGN, the Third World Sustainable Development Network in Brazil. So what better intellectual to start with than Professor Monti. And the speaker today would speak for 35 to 40 minutes and led by discussion. And the discussion to say here is Dr. Jabin Chi Jacob is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at Chief Nada University. And he's also the adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. He was former fellow and assistant director also of the Institute of Chinese Studies and associate editor of the journal China Report. So recently his book, China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Policies under Xi Jinping, just got released by Palgrave Macmillan in June. And so we look forward to a very fruitful discussion after that all. So may I request Professor Mohanty to take the floor. Oh, we can't hear you, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think there is something wrong with my earphone, this particular one. Well, I'm very pleased to be speaking today to the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. I have long association with this department right from its inception. And I have had so many close friends. We have done so many projects together. And can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I can see Professor Suri also there. Good to see you. And now so many students of mine are in the faculty. So and that some students have retired also from the same department. I'm very pleased indeed. Actually, our mind is full of two or three big things. One, of course, is the pandemic. Now it's more than 16 million worldwide, and India's cases have crossed 16 lakhs, and the death toll worldwide is 6.8 lakh, and India's 39,000 plus, about 39,000. So that is, of course, the big um, concern everybody has, and the cases are rising. And you'd notice that whereas in US they continue to spike, and the second wave in Europe has come. Now it is in Latin America and Africa, and some Asian countries are also having second wave. So, uh, and very interesting to see that, very depressing actually, to see that first it was mostly the poor in developed countries who suffered, and now the poor countries, and the poor among them particularly, are suffering more. So pandemic one is one big preoccupation. But right now in India, tomorrow is the 5th August, and several of us in the civil liberty movement and as a part of the Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, we are having a counting days campaign from day one till yesterday was the 365th day. And tomorrow there will be many discussions and sort of symbolic protests and so on, actual protests. I'm writing a note every day for the last 5 days on this protest. Some of you are in my mailing list also for that. And tomorrow also they have chosen to have the foundation laying ceremony of the Ram Temple. So one's mind is really focused on so many of these things. And in between has come the big for us, the National Education Policy 2020. And we have to read, comment, discuss, grasp, and so activities on that front also have started. Therefore, in the midst of all that, we are discussing today the pandemic and what is its wider meaning. That's what I want to focus on. Actually, the discussion on the pandemic has not focused on these issues, what I call the Faultlines. What is a fault line? Fault line is a serious crack in a large system, which has the potential of upsetting the total character of the system. Fault line leads to earthquake and things like that. I want to talk about 3 major fault lines. Every time I did speak on a related topic in the Kerala University Political Science department a month ago. But between that day and today, I have even more facets in my mind and on these fault lines. And I'm not only even more deeply involved in reflecting on them than before. I will talk about 3 major fault lines. One is I hope you have circulated the abstract. Have you been? Has the abstract been circulated? Yes or no?
No.
No?
No, sir.
Okay, then let me read out the abstract.
Yes. Yes.
I think that will be a good beginning. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has succeeded in bringing before us many social, political, economic, environmental outlines, which can no longer be ignored and must be addressed urgently. The first is the phenomenon of inequality in power, status, wealth, and living conditions, which has been growing rapidly in recent decades within countries and between countries. I will talk more about it. So one is the rising inequality on multiple fronts. The second is the clear decline of publicness in society, economy, and politics. Inspired by capitalism, individual enterprise and private initiative have been eulogized to such an extent that the state's investment in basic public goods, such as health, education, housing, and child welfare, have remained woefully inadequate. And especially the commitment to address climate change and environmental crisis has been missing, almost missing. This is the second fault line, the decline in publicness, as I put it, but you understand. It is public investment, role of the community as a whole to address these problems and so on. The role of the state as a whole to address these problems. The third fault line is the over-centralization of power, leading to a clear decline of democracy by manipulating institutional mechanisms and making full use of technology of mass communication, and by engaging in what I call disaster mobilization, direct appeal, and carrying the public opinion in emotive terms, and thus to mobilize votes in the process also. If these emerging fault lines don't engage global rulers immediately, then the sufferings faced by humanity the world over will explode into much violence, much alienation, and many other problems. Those are the three fault lines that I will talk about: rising inequality, declining publicness, and decline of democracy, or over-centralization of power within countries, in politics, economy, culture, communication, and also in the global order, how the monopolistic trends in communication, in economy, and also in military power and ability to influence the global process, how that also has been over-centralized. And these I call fault lines because rising inequality is already generating and will generate even more dysfunctionalities. Declining public investment and declining publicness as a whole will create so many vulnerabilities, and also rising inequalities and alienation and distress that it will cause enormous alienation and discontent. And same with the decline of democracy and loss of self-governance, loss of autonomy, having a lot of serious implications. Let's start with the end. I will give examples from India, China, and United States mainly, but also globally. I will preface, and this section I will skip because I think in 35 minutes I cannot cover that. I have a section on the need for humility at this time. There is a failure in India, in China, in US, not only Brazil, Russia, and so on. But leaders of all these countries are boasting of their ability to manage it well and, victory in the People's War against pandemic. That is the headline in China, and so on. If you read Prime Minister Modi's letter on the completion of 1 year to citizens of India, he also talks about victory or imminent victory. And you know how Trump is boasting about his ability to having tackled it, and so on. And though the objective reality in all these three countries And the propaganda drive in China doesn't make us aware of the Faultlines in China. But take away the propaganda line. Javin has a recent excellent paper on China's propaganda strategy in the COVID period, in China, latest China report. If you just see beneath the propaganda, you will see the many-sided failures. So there is no humility on the part of our leaders. And in fact, this is a time when all the systems were under challenge, under re-examination. And instead of admitting limitations of our knowledge, our capacity, all the leaders are boasting of their victories. Only the scientists, the doctors, the scientists, they are the humble lot. They are desperately trying to tell everybody, look, we don't know. We are still working on the vaccine. Don't prematurely announce the vaccines. Don't prematurely announce opening up. Or when you open up, absolutely stick to these norms. I think a discourse on humility is in order at this global historical moment. Now, let's take the rising inequalities. The first fault line. I think just imagine, you have to keep in mind, you have to visualize. I could have put those pictures of the migrant labor on the streets on the 24th, 25th, those, the first week after the lockdown was announced by the Prime Minister giving 4-hour notice. And today, 4 months plus after, it is they who are still suffering. And today, because they lived in the congested houses, they came in unsafe and vulnerable transportation, they were most susceptible to the infection. And you'll find that in the quarantine centers, there are lots of cases of infection and also in the crowded places. And so the poor people have suffered more. True, the rich, our Home Minister or Amitabh Bachchan and the other rich people, they also got it. So the disease doesn't discriminate that way. But the impact on the ground, if you see how starkly unequal the effects have been. Labor has been the greatest victim, not only because of the lockdown, which forced migrant labor. Factories were closed, and according to the CMIE data, 14 crore, 140 million lost jobs. So, yesterday, Manmohan Singh's article in the Hindu said that only in Manrega there are 62 million who have been engaged, and not everybody has joined Manrega. In other words, unemployment has increased. According to one survey, 60% of the people have lost 2/3 of their nutrition component of their diet during the first 2 months, April, May, and so on. In other words, labor, poor people, and minorities. There has been a study of Dharavi and the other clusters of congested areas. In the first 2 months, 2/3 of the deaths in Mumbai were Muslims. And remember the post-Tablighi, episode. and how the minorities also have suffered more. And women have been subjected to domestic violence, extra work, and many studies have now come out clearly. And among the independent migrant women workers who have, whose number is rising during the last 10 years, particularly in India, the impact has been very severe. So just to take the Indian case, in terms of, and of course, among the contract labor, migrant labor, informal labor, it is the Dalits, Adivasis, OBCs, poor people, and women who are a large component. Therefore, this intersectional inequality is very evident, which has been very, very starkly the citadel of suffering. In the US, it is the Black Americans, the African Americans, who suffered the most among the dead, among the infected, as well as among the those who have lost jobs. Of course, 41 million is the unemployment today in the US, and it is the all workers from African Americans, Asian Americans, the white workers also. So it is the vulnerable sections. In UK, the same thing. In UK, among the health workers, doctors and nurses, it is the non-white population, especially South Asians, who have been the victims. Now, in Africa today, the pandemic is on the rise, and especially among the poor, among the workers. So I think there has been discussion on rising inequality in the last 10 years. Stiglitz and some others have brought this into focus. But in policy terms, this is not on priority. In the, I read a report from China yesterday that they have more or less achieved the moderately well-off society in all respects, the Xiaokang in all respects. And they gave so many figures to prove that. And they do hope that absolute poverty will be zero by the end of this year, because 2020 is that deadline. But you see, the migrant laborers were the greatest sufferers in China, and in minority areas also. We don't get the full reports, but this has been quite prevalent in the minority areas. And no doubt, after the first wave, they have taken a lot of strong measures to restrict the spread and reduce the mortality. But even now, according to one estimate, only 60% of the migrant laborers have joined. According to another estimate, it is even less, though the economy seems to have been restored at least 80%. I mean, they claim more than 90%. Javin will speak more about that. So rising inequalities is one thing which has come face to face to us during the pandemic. Come to the second, decline in publicness. Public investment in education, health, social infrastructure has been reducing proportionately. And what was most significantly visible was the absence of primary healthcare centers at the panchayat level in India, at the Chun level, the village level in China, and absence of universal health care in US. Trump didn't even allow Obamacare, which is not a great program, but at least 50 million poor were getting some additional benefits for sure. Even that Trump didn't allow. In other words, public investment in minimum infrastructure in terms of health and education. And health and education are areas where inequality is most evident, both in China, India, and of course in US. In fact, in US, the scale of hierarchy may be less than India and China in terms of the hierarchical systems of access to health and access to school education particularly. Whereas in India and China, they are highly unequal. And this is not a top priority in either of the two countries. The Right to Education Act has been implemented fully only up to, well, some say 9%, but the most liberal estimate is 15% it has been implemented fully. And the new education policy promises extension and more investment, but this 6% investment was there in the Kothari Commission also in 66, 68. And that has not happened. We are still at about 2% or less. And health, only about 1%, a little above 1% sometimes. And therefore, public investment has been declining. But what is worse is the sort of making the concept of public as a dirty word, as if individual and private initiative are to be celebrated. That's how civilization has grown. Civilization has grown with individuals, groups, regions, entire community, whole societies, all working together at all levels. Therefore, this disinvestment, privatization for the last 30 years since 1991, these words have become so prominent. And if you watch the 4 techno high-tech giant leaders' testimony before the US Congress last week, one of them said that some people think that big is bad. Goodness, the Congressional Committee is precisely concerned that monopoly and this, it is an antitrust committee, antitrust context, which was discussing that. And in India, we used to have a monopoly and trade practices restrictive, that commission against monopoly and trade practices, monopolistic trade practice, that has been disbanded. So monopoly, big and merger, big is beautiful, that big is efficient. That is what is being celebrated all over. And therefore, this privatization has become the norm. And today, we suddenly saw how in all countries, it is the state which came to the rescue of the peasants, of the workers. Very little it did for the workers particularly. But the health coordination was led, even in capitalist countries, by the state. US, Germany, UK, all by the state. India, China, of course. And when it came down to the actual implementation at the government of the provincial level, the state level, the regional level, the district level, today the district collector is managing the lockdown and the health management. Quarantine centers are located in the panchayats, another public institution. So suddenly we realize pandemic has questioned this decline of publicness, and has alerted us about the value of publicness. So how public and private have to come together, particularly under the leadership of the public. And my third Faultline, I'll take another 5 minutes, Bain. Can I take another 5 minutes? How many minutes more can I take? Are you listening to me?
Professor Mohanty, we are fine. We are fine. Please go ahead. Even 10 minutes would be fine. 10, 15 minutes would be fine.
If I might add, actually, I have another engagement, so 5 minutes perhaps would be the best.
Okay, 5 minutes. So that's better. The third one is obvious to this group: decline of democracy and over-centralization. Now, we saw a very interesting paradox during the pandemic. Central government, the health ministry, the prime minister himself seems to be commanding. But actually the doctors and the state governments actually have been the real decision makers. You know, Kerala, Odisha, they showed the real examples. Not just the chief ministers, you know, the system and the district and the panchayat. But what had happened? You know, the communication mobilization and the manipulation of institutions, and you saw how the Supreme Court first dismissed the migrant labor case, but later on, when many appeals were made and it was criticized, it then began to make some suggestions. It is yet to hear whether the case on constitutionality of the August 5 Kashmir abrogation and so on. So institutional maneuver during the pandemic itself, our government has taken so many steps to change the pattern of the economy. It introduced an environment assessment, a new draft environment assessment, impact assessment, EIA. So many concessions to capital, abolishing labor rights and changing the labor laws. So many state governments guided by the center and so on. So centralization has been going on, and it is going on even now. But the paradox is COVID, the actual concrete policies were formulated and implemented at the provincial and the local level. But the resources are all at the center, no doubt about it. That is the paradox. And similarly, you know, the four high-tech giants, when they were speaking, they were being examined by the Congressional Committee. You witness the monopoly, how we have all become tools in the centralized high-tech monopolies. And now there are some competitions, some wars coming up in the global level between the Chinese giants and the American giants and so on. Now let me conclude by saying the following, that the talk among the elite circles and the dominant media is about restoration, recovery, not about changing the paradigm, not about reducing inequality being the primary goal, not about public commitment to education, health, not about democracy, decentralization, participative democracy, not about decentralized world order. And for example, I have a sentence in my paper which says, any polar, unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, the concept of the pole will be under attack in the post-COVID world, because all the big poles have been exposed during the pandemic and otherwise. So they are all talking about restoring the old order by using various coercive, manipulative, and other measures. But I can see the coming days as days of intensified struggle because now certain trends have been unleashed. They were already on. Struggle for equity, autonomy, participatory democracy, against environment. I couldn't cover the environmental failures, but everybody knows about that. I think those things are going to be very, very important. So we are in for intense struggle over these goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. So may I ask Dr. Jebin Jacob to throw on the light and make the comment and discuss the topics.
Okay. Thank you, Beam. Let me thank the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, for inviting me. To Professor Manjari Kachu and Professor Swan for hosting me. My thanks also to Beam for coordinating. I have to say that I am a bit of a fish out of water here. I am an area studies person, currently surrounded by political scientists. And I might be focused more, of course, on the China angle. Professor Mohanty's paper, in the next 10 minutes, what I'll sort of try to do is, I've read the paper, so I will also relate my comments to the paper. Professor Mohanty, as always, has a large canvas. Whether it is political science or China studies, his canvas is inevitably large. It's a short paper, but it makes some very, very big points. The 3 points that he talks about: inequality in power, status that is on show, the clear decline in publicness, and the over-centralization of power. These are actually issues that these are trends that have been on display for quite some time, but the COVID pandemic, of course, brings that up front and center, and it doesn't limit these trends only to the poor and the downtrodden, but it also sort of spreads across classes and communities, shall we say. Now, very quickly, I want to start, and I'll sort of get straight to it. I want to start by asking the question whether the opening assumptions are correct. Change is inevitable, but is progress also necessarily inevitable? In his paper, Professor Mohanty talks about GDP, the economic doldrums, how the Human Development Index has declined post-COVID. But what I'd like to argue is that if one sort of looks at progress as an inevitable sort of as a linear progression, then these sort of events and eventualities trouble us. That is, when the GDP declines or economic growth declines or the HDI declines, then we sort of tend to get troubled. But the fact of the matter is that large sections of human population in history have never been part of the growth story. All right. And China's growth, in fact, is a central case in point. Even though, as it was just mentioned, the Chinese talk about removing absolute poverty by the end of this year. Absolute poverty is just the number of people living under $2 a day. So in that sense, it's about just another 10 million people in China that need to be lifted from absolute poverty. But that isn't the end of their struggle. Poverty continues to exist in China, and the Gini coefficient of inequality, in China is actually massive. It's not so much a lack of basic essentials in China that is a problem, but the sort of comparison with your better off, that is the problem in China. The question that follows is then, why is human suffering a concern of politics today? or to sort of put it in the words that Professor Mohanty talked about, why is publicness, not on display, or why does publicness decline? I think the prevention of human suffering, of course, is the origin of politics, or at least its prevention for a certain class or group at the expense of others is really what the study of politics is all about. And the question then I have to ask is, do all human beings matter? Is that what we see as when we study politics, or when we study China or India, that comes to view? And I'm not asking if they matter equally, because of course the answer is that yes, all human beings matter. But that is because I think we, in a way, have been conditioned or programmed to believe that, at least within the halls of academia, at least among this particular audience. But in practice, I think, as COVID underlines, that is not true. It has never been true. And therefore, one has to ask another question of our assumptions. That is, if every human being matters equally, then they also don't matter. Because, as if you ask what the Chinese think, they say, well, there's enough of them, right? And that's really the Chinese model, that of a meritocracy, of pathways cleared for certain people uh, on some notion of merit defined by people, again, selected according to apparently merit, defining that, okay, these are the people that can get to the next level, while the rest of them can just about survive. And I think, we need to, and this is something that I could sort of say that it is sort of drives much of Professor Monti's work, which is politics as an examination of the departure from the ideal. But I think we need to actually study politics as an examination of what is in reality the case. The ideal sometimes, our emphasis on the ideal often weakens us. People trying to do good are often weakened by not focusing on the reality. That's why they have this phrase, nice guys finish second. So, in this case, I think what the world has come to see is that China's politics is authoritarian. So the Chinese do not follow international law. They follow self-interest above all. But willy-nilly, they are in a position today where much of the third world, which India also claimed leadership over, is willing to go along with what the Chinese do or Chinese say, even when they are suffering from the effects of COVID. So then, we have other questions arising, which is that, is participatory democracy a good thing? You look at the debates within India. Look at this debate that has just been set off. We should, well, not recently set off, but the fact that we should move to a presidential system, or that India needs strongman leadership for a time in order to get things in order. And I think I would disagree with Professor Mohanty when he says that the scientific community is somehow above board or humble. In fact, I would say that as we see on the border with in Ladakh, we see both in the scientific community and the military community in India a tendency to actually vie for political currency, a tendency to actually catch the ear of the political leadership to say things that the political leadership wants. I mean, how is it that we adopted the lockdown model in a country like ours? If it were not for scientists strongly arguing that the COVID pandemic would spread to the population in exactly the same mode that it is spreading in China or in any other country. I mean, in a sense, I think we've tended to valorize scientific rationale without taking into account, social conditions. So I think, in a way, scientists are also guilty of the kind of state of affairs that we are in. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Why are certain scientists, listened to? Why aren't certain other scientists listened to? Or why is a certain point of view talked about, and why not others? So, and that, is only underlines the reason why studying China is so important. And Professor Monti referred to the new education policy. And one of the features of the new education policy is that Chinese has been dropped as a foreign language for Indians to study. I mean, if that is the sort of attitude that you have towards knowledge accretion, towards knowledge or capacity building, then we are in a certain degree of trouble, because that isn't scientific if you think about it. Why does over centralization occur? I mean, this is an interesting question, and I think we are now forced to sort of go back to certain classic Western literature that has for long been perhaps sidelined or discredited. And one of those concepts is the Asiatic mode of production. If you look at how our workers were literally having to flee the cities on foot, and how the powers that be did not take into account the fact that there's a whole population under the radar that also needs to be catered to. One has to think about how far advanced we are as an economic entity or as a political entity, whether there is any real uh, democracy or any real adherence to meritocracy, however defined, that exists in Indian society. It is essentially Oriental despotism. I mean, we might call ourselves a democracy, but essentially that is what we are. And how is it that political scientists in India, are not able to engage with this in a much more forthright manner, and how it ends up always as a sort of a confrontation? Only when push comes to shove do these sort of issues sort of come to the forefront. I think that there's a problem there. Finally, I was very taken by Professor Mohanty's emphasis on humility, because I'm trying to figure out whether there is a political science or a political definition for humility. I mean, how does one understand, or how does one conceptualize humility? Again, I think one of the problems with looking at it perhaps too philosophically is, this ties in very well with what the Chinese leadership say today in their anti-corruption drive, or when the Communist Party of China puts itself forward as a representative of the people, when it argues against bureaucratism or formalism, it can say that it is being humble, that Chinese leaders are actually representing the people, and democratic centralism is a form of humility. And I think we need to sort of be very careful there when we talk about, when you sort of introduce these concepts, one has to sort of see what the impact is. I mean, Professor Mohanty's point has been about people like Trump or Bolsonaro, or our Prime Minister or Putin, ignoring scientific advice sometimes, or believing that hope is around the corner, or ignoring good advice. But this can also be taken in a different direction, I'd say. In fact, one could argue, why then not make a case for religion or faith? In fact, if you look at Indian politics today, that's exactly the way it's going. When you're banging thalis or lighting diyas, in addition to some sort of a quasi or false science, which justifies lockdown, which justifies the introduction of apps to control people's movement and gather information, you also make a case for believing in the supernatural, in the extraordinary, and say that, well, this you can justify it by saying this is to prevent despair. And I think therefore perhaps we should ask ourselves if there is not a case to be made for political science and political scientists to engage more deeply with questions of faith and with religion, not just as an empirical phenomenon to be studied, but actually to treat religion or faith as a tactile living organism that is both changed and changes politics. And in a way, you see that happening in China, because that's why they talk about new ideas they want to introduce, such as, say, Neo-Confucianism or the Chinese dream. And I think, I think when you come back to it, I would say the most febrile, the most vital, or the discussions of the greatest vitality actually take place within this authoritarian system called the Communist Party of China. It might be closed off to the regular people. It might be a discussion perhaps at a very rarefied level, but it is not an echo chamber. There is a great deal of learning, and somehow democracies, and we see what's happening with the United States or what's happening with the EU project falling apart, I think we tend to sort of forget that this is not happening also in democracies, despite their nature as democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeben. So, if Professor Modi can respond, and we can go to the next.
Because I want to listen to the others. Thank you, Javin. Let me start from the last. I mean, I didn't engage really on the question of faith and tradition, but that's a very important point. But on humility, firstly, I think I did include Xi Jinping in the same group as the others. And CPC today, and I think it has never been, a carrier of humility as a great value. Yes, there have been some occasions of criticism of boastfulness and things like that, but today the Chinese model, the Chinese way of handling COVID is glorified and being propagated all over, and the cult of personality of Xi Jinping being upheld, and therefore I think there I will say that they are the they also need to think about humility, meaning the fallibility of their convictions, despite the many rounds of discussions and a very powerful system of consultation, debate, and so on. No, on the scientist thing, I think you are right. I may have put it in an exaggerated form. It was only a relative statement compared to Trump. Look at Fauci. Compared to our leaders, look at some of our doctors. They hedge and haw. Yes, some of the the example of Guleria I don't want to discuss, but someday his role will be discussed. But I think he has been very careful, not boastful at all, and therefore it was a relative statement. But you are right. There is also a cult of science which is celebrated, just as authoritarian politics. Authoritarian science is also quite a problem. Now, on the question of politics, placed between ideal and real, we have dealt with this question all our life. I think just putting it that way or formulating that question that way is problematic. I think every political intervention is about transformation, change. There is an agenda, there is a constitution, there is a party manifesto, there is a objective which brings together people together to form a party. There is always an ideal to achieve, and there is a real to cope with, to be transformed. Therefore, to put it as being rooted in the real and grappling with the real, I think that formulation is what one would like to change. And therefore, the debate on democracy, I think, is a good debate going on all over the world. That we don't have an ideal democracy anywhere in the world, and yet everybody would like, not China just now, but certainly serious debates wherever they are taking place, they all want to move towards democracy as greater autonomy, greater decentralization, greater value for freedom of speech, dissent, institutional functioning, and wherever they are under attack, that is under criticism. And I think one implication from your discussion was, and this has been made not by you today, but generally, that authoritarian regimes probably, like Chinese regime, was better equipped to deal with the pandemic. Not so. In fact, when it is a question of war, pandemic, such things, it doesn't matter whether it's an authoritarian system or a democratic system formally. They work according to what is decided by the command. But it is not always the democratic way of exercising power. Therefore, democracies can deal with pandemic and deal with such crises also in their own ways as effectively. And we have seen in different democracies in Europe, I mean, just contrast Germany with US. Finally, the this publicness and whether politics and progress have to be disjointed, and it is not about equality. It's some people doing always better than others. Now, that is a question of value. I think drive for equality is a universal trend. Equality is not mathematical sameness or anything like that, but it is reducing conditions which produce domination, material and political conditions, cultural conditions which deprive some people of power and create conditions of domination. And therefore, any civilization's assessment of itself is about to what extent, in what direction was it moving. And in this era, equality.
It's 16 hours.
Equality is a very important value that is among the paramount values driving civilization. That's all. Thank you for, as always, very interesting and provocative comments.
So may I ask any other, attendees to, ask questions? However, there are 3 questions here. So Jitendra Panda, if you can ask your questions, you can just put up questions to the speaker. Hello. So his question was, is this can I read the question, sir?
Yes.
So is this just one step along the road to a new education paradigm? Sir, what is your opinion about new education policy? Is it good or bad? Thank you.
It is, I'm a critic of it for 2 reasons. No doubt it has many very important value statements which I support. But on the whole, I critique it, and therefore I will give you my 2 major comments. But we do hope that today we are not discussing NEP, we are discussing the Faultlines. But this is one of the Faultlines. The new education policy does not aim at reducing inequalities. The so-called universalization of school education, from preschool to secondary, does not aim at reducing the various types of schools, which are hierarchical, which give different kinds of education, and therefore, take for instance the mother tongue. Mother tongue is not compulsory as the medium in the first 3 years. It says wherever possible, and therefore it makes it conditional. But the most important criticism is that to make school education equally accessible, both in quantity as well as quality, and be an instrument of reducing inequalities. Education, particularly school education, should be a channel to reduce inequalities. That's where people can come up, families can be transformed into capable families with new sources of income in the next generation and so on. As a universal goal, that is not happening in this. This is my first comment. The second comment is it institutionalizes and eulogizes privatization, commercialization, a communalization. I think that is a very subtle introduction of communal Hindu values in the name of Indic culture, Sanskrit, and so on. And third, robotization. It celebrates skill to such an extent that it equates education with skill building. Education is skill plus values plus creative ability formation. Education is about formation of creative abilities, from philosophy to making things, that is skill. Comprehending things, reflecting upon things. So thinking ability to making ability, both are important, equally important. And you have commercialization, communalization, robotization. This is my second comment, besides the comment about lack of interest in equity. That is why I'll be part of a major critical process of debate on this educational policy. But I'm also writing another piece, how while implementing it, you should use the constitutional and legal provisions of autonomy of the state, district, panchayat, etc., the powers available with us, and the ways we can bring in equity, humanities, integrality of education, social relevance, and so on in our own way while implementing this policy, because the governments and all political parties will force us, major political parties will force us to implement this policy. While implementing this, how you use the constitution to pursue constitutional goals irrespective of this education policy, that strategy is very important.
Thank you, sir. So may I ask Mr. Malik to pose this question to Professor? Hello? Mr. Malik? Oh, then we can move on to Mr. Pravat Lama. You have a question. You can pose to Professor.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, Mr. Malik. Yeah, please.
Sir, yes, sir. My question to Professor Mohanty, sir. Sir, actually, do you feel that the participatory democracy at grassroots level that has been already collapsed in Indian context? Do you feel really?
It has not collapsed, but it is not institutionalized.
Yes.
Now, we have two kinds of participatory politics at the grassroots level. One through panchayats, the other through social movements and social action groups like NGOs. Okay? Panchayats have been made into delivery mechanism channels. Gram Sabha has to identify targets, and the World Bank inspired centrally sponsored schemes have to be implemented by the panchayat, with fund going from the top to the bottom. We have to reconceptualize panchayat as instruments of real power, and they have to have resources. They have to have the capacity to generate resources. I have just written an article which says the real answer to migrant labor, distress migration is panchayats planning for no unemployment, zero unemployment development program. So for that, panchayat has to have power and resources under the constitution. So you have to reconceptualize the panchayat.
Sir, hello.
Secondly, the social movement component has been weakened because all social movements are turned into NGOs, and those NGOs which are independent, they are pressurized to become conformist NGOs with the prevailing regime, whichever party regime it is. So social movements have been de-emphasized in India for the last 30 years. Whereas we believed from Sarvodaya tradition, JP movement, post-emergency developments in India, that social movements are so important. So people have to really take charge of what they ought to do at that level. But that is not built into our planning. Of course, planning has been disbanded. That is not believed. And therefore, profit-centric private entrepreneurship, that is the norm which has been promoted. So grassroots politics has been de-emphasized. But people are getting conscious. So therefore, the movement for grassroots politics and grassroots power will continue.
So there's one,
Thank you, sir.
yeah. So if I may ask, like Dr. Vikas Tripathi, he has a question on leadership and centralization of power. He's from Assam University. Yes.
Yes.
So Vikas Tripathi, Dr. Vikas?
Can we ask people to switch on their video, please?
Yeah. So may I ask everyone to, switch on a video? So if I have to come back, Dr. Vikas, please. Dr. Vikas Tripathi, Hello? Dr. Vikas.
Yeah, please unmute yourself and speak. Yes, please.
Hello, Dr. Vikas. Oh, we can come back to him later. But there is a question by Mr. Dr. Pravat Lama. Professor Mohanty, sir, sir, you said post-COVID would be somewhat restoring to old one. So what do you be the position and role of the state in the post-COVID world? So he's asking that most of the elites are trying to restore to the old order. So what would be your position, and what would be your position in the new world order or the post-COVID world order?
I would have my main focus on building the local health and education infrastructure as accessible to common people, and state must invest in that. We must demand that every panchayat should have a well-equipped primary health center, and every district must have a well-equipped diagnostic as well as good hospital, so that they don't have to go to even the big cities in the state. And public investment, government has to give the money, has to invest money in that. Same with education. In my view, the answer to the new education policy is to have every state, already they have IITs, IIMs, but they should have institutes of advanced centers in science, philosophy, humanities, language. Every district should have Institute of Advanced Studies and connect with others in the country and in the world. Nobody can prevent that in the modern age. That's how you can overcome this intermediate, the Higher Education Council, which will control all of us hereafter. So state has to invest in local education and health. And please remember, a good mass base will have a greater baseline out of which more good students and able citizens can come up. If the base is weak, then we have only a few exceptions who are coming up. You see, that is why in the post-COVID world, we must insist that state spends more on health, education, and also the privatizes these private schools. I think public schools, government schools have to be as good or even better. I think Delhi government has shown some example, more or less, that it is possible. They have, have had 25% of their state budget on education. So, but on health, they are not equally successful, as was proven during the pandemic. So, health, education, these are very important, and zero unemployment at the block level. That should be the target of the plan. And when they migrate to other places, they go with bargaining power for economic reasons and so on. Therefore, that should be our goal in the post-pandemic world.
Thank you, sir. Professor Suri, do you have any questions, sir? Hello.
Suri, good to see you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Namaste, sir. Professor Mohanty. My namaskars to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I'm so happy to see you and to hear your talk, which is truly a Manoranjan one. It excites mind and ideas. I thought, sir, while I agree and appreciate significantly with what you have said on the three aspects that you have touched upon, on the class divide and on the public and on the functioning of democracies across the world, I want to just bring to your consideration a few points. Number one is that when you talk of fault lines, geological fault lines, we can do nothing. We can do very little about them. They happen, they keep happening. Because geologists tell us that these are tectonic plates that keep moving beneath the earth, and there is always a clash and a collision of these plates, and as a result, there are these slips happen, and the kind of the surface, at the surface, we see these slips and cracks and ruptures, and we have to live with them, and we have to at least try to predict and take sufficient caution to mitigate the damage to us. So that's but then what I think you have in mind is a kind of a sociological fault lines of these three aspects, which can be addressed and can be alleviated and can be actually rectified to a great extent. So that is the premise of when you talk of fault lines, the global fault lines along these three planes that you have identified. But here again, one submission is that this is COVID is a global phenomenon, and also it is something happening beyond the control of the classes or the political elites. So it is not a purely kind of a man-made, in the sense that it is class division or it is the democracy, political arrangement of democracy, etc. COVID is a disease that has been spread due to, there are different theories about it, but we know that it is a kind of a natural thing that is happening, and how humanity can address it and then ameliorate the situation. This has been happening from ancient times. This kind of mass infectious disease have been happening in ancient times, and then in the olden days, millions and millions of people died, and today we are in such a situation where we can address, we have certain medicines and we have certain facilities where the human loss need not be on the same lines as it happened in 1918 or before. I want to just say three things to reflect on what you said. It's not a counter to what you said. It is not a defense of what you said. And it's just further reflections on what you said. Number one is, I think the COVID what did to these fault lines is to open up possibilities of new thinking on all the three aspects you have identified, on the class divide, on the public activities, and on the democracy functioning. So on the class divide, it again wonders that certain diseases can go beyond class divisions. They can affect the rich also. So, so public health is something which transcends class division. And in fact, the rich and the elite sections must try to ensure public health, not in the interest of the poor, but in their own interests. That lesson, I think, they have taught us.
Yeah.
That when the chief ministers, Amitabh Bachchan gets infected, Amit Shah gets infected, or our Karnataka chief minister gets infected, or some governor in some state is getting infected. So the thing is that you cannot have good health unless your neighbor has a good health. You cannot have good health unless common people have a good health, because they come and work in your home. The maid servant lives in a slum and comes to my home. The milk vendor lives in a slum and comes to my home. So I live as a part of society. I cannot live in an island. However, fortification I can make a 2 feet China wall, but still the diseases come. So a healthy society cannot be built when the class divisions are acute. I think this lesson the COVID brings to us. A second thing, sir, is you know I think it's also changing the kind of understanding we have about the public, because publics we have understood so far as human collectivities of different social status or occupation, grouped along with a particular characteristic, right? There are different publics. And then public activity as organized activity of these human collectivities in public spaces or in open spaces physically. But I think this understanding may undergo some change, given the kind of we are forced to interact with people now, kind of differently. So I see youngsters especially engaged in different collective activities, not in the way we imagined before, but in a slightly different manner. A third reflection on what you said, I think on democracy also, sir, I think what is happening, the COVID is doing is that it is also opening up a kind of a new possibilities of a different kind of democracy. And today, all over the world, there is a talk of online voting. It is happening. Even in the United States, the debate is now happening whether how much online voting can be allowed. So there can be greater participation. So in a way, there is a greater seclusion of individuals, confinement of individuals to their residences, to their homes, etc., to their private spaces, but their public participation can increase. And I think actually we are moving towards a kind of direct democracy of a different type, not the ancient Athenian type, where all citizens came and sat in agora and deliberated and voted. I think that was the world where a small citizenry was there in Athens. Maximum citizenship number in Athens, in ancient Athens, was 33,000. That is the peak citizenship. But here we have large nations, and I think the COVID made us our cabinet meetings are taking place online, parliament sessions are happening online in different countries, and in India also they are planning to do that. So I think, and it is possible. I am imagining a situation after several years, not now, where every citizen can vote in the evening. The government can say this is the legislation bill, and we all can vote in the evening. We can all see the proposals and then vote. So I think COVID also is teaching us are telling us, at least, are showing new directions in which the politics can move. While I agree with you about how politicians are becoming dictatorial and autocratic, on the other side, there is also a counter movement of more and more people, at least able to, or their avenues are open for their political participation, which leads to qualitatively new kind of democracy. There is a possibility. So, so my submission is that the COVID is, offering us a kind of new perspectives on cross divisions in the society, and it is opening up new possibilities of public participation in political or public affairs, and also showing us the new directions in which democracies can function. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Suri. I think those were wonderful and very meaningful comments. I agree with all three reflections. They, in fact, substantially expand my formulations. I will further add, and if you noticed, I was talking about also paradoxes in each case, and that I would underline. For example, the paradox in the first case, class, caste, gender division, is that the rationalization of inequality in the name of efficiency, that we need more growth, or we need stability, or we need peace. Let us first recover, then we'll talk about reservation. That trend of thought also is likely to get some momentum in the context of emergency recovery. So that paradox, so that on the one hand, there are new possibilities. On the other hand, the paradox will also be operative. The new collectivities, I think that's a wonderful point. Indeed, the internet groups have emerged, and I think the paradox in this case is that the capacity of the internet company monopolies to restrict our rights, to decide who can intervene, who cannot, and have more hackers of their kind. And, the bans, counter bans, openings, so technology works both ways. And therefore, and COVID has opened up these, but at the same time, that paradox exists. Same with democracy. I think you saw, I mentioned disaster mobilization, direct, everyday press conferences, emotive appeals, charismatic attempt to build charisma, and so on. And linking culture, mobilization, politics, health, superstition, everything, and so on. I think what is a danger in the case of the technological dimensions of electoral politics is that the ability to hack and maneuver in a large scale, because that technology is also, you have on the one hand some checks and foolproof ballot machines and so on. On the other hand, there are also those possibilities which have come up, which we cannot rule out. Therefore, I think all these new possibilities are very real. Thank you for pointing them out. But they come with some paradoxical elements at the same time.
There are quite a few questions on education. One,
I will just connect it with my, I find that the connection is, carry on.
Yeah, one by Dr. Moses. He says one of the top critiques of education policy is that of crossing the area of federal structure.
Yeah.
So, and in the same tone, there are questions between the old education policy and the new, which is better. And yeah, and also like Mr. Jadav Pratap Singh's question, I think, has been taken up by the speaker, and which has been actually been asked also by Professor Suri. So I think that has been dealt here. So on the basis of on the question on education, so which was like, is it old versus the new, and what would be the new challenges with regard to the state and the center on the aspect of education?
In my view, the new education policy centralizes educational administration in an unprecedented way. I mean, it was happening already, and already UGC, then HRD, all that centralization was there. But now with the Higher Education Council and 2 or 3 other very important councils, things are very highly centralized. And therefore, it is an affront on federalism, Indian federalism, no doubt about it. And I mean, I read yesterday Amitabh Kant, CEO Niti Aayog, article in the Indian Express. He says that how many lakh panchayats we have? They were all consulted. This new education policy is the product of, discussions among academics, etc., and also all the 2 lakh or how many lakh? I'm sorry, I don't remember just now. Panchayats of the country, and this is ridiculous. This is the kind of statement which they make, saying that it is the product of great consultation. Of course, there were debates, criticisms which were conveyed, but very little of that is reflected in the final document. The final document reflects the original premises of the Kasturirangan Committee and then the draft which was circulated. Therefore, I don't say the old education policy was any better. We were critics of that also. But on 3 things we have to really grapple and take positions and work. One, the constitutional vision, the preamble and the basic values of the Constitution. To what extent? Equality, freedom, rationality, reservation, equity, those things. On that, how much of this policy shows commitment. In my view, that is the greatest danger. It subverts the constitutional paradigm. Number 2, resources for implementation. And they will say that, you have to raise resources. You go for public-private partnership and so on. That is another way of continuing privatization. And they want global universities to come, and they're already here in some ways. Now they will be here legitimately with campuses in India and so on. But we would have, in fact, I have a paper, I don't know how many of you have seen that, the poor BA student, crisis of undergraduate education in India. The BA education is the most neglected sector in the country. And the new 4-year course, unless it addresses some of the old problems of inequity, lack of quality, mass expansion, poor teacher-student ratio, lack of resources of education, and the basic support structure. So BA has been neglected. We have institutions of eminence, and we are now some talk about school education, but the BA education has been the neglected sector, and my fear is it will continue to be neglected in the next 4 years, next many years under the new policy. So we must demand more resources, ask the central government and state government to provide more resources. This is number 2. Number 3, focus on what power the Constitution gives. I said this before. What power the Constitution gives to the state government, panchayat, district, and so on, and use that. Use the retired teachers, retired retired civil servants, retired, other personnel. Make use of them to provide alternative education to supplement, to complement the robotic turn, the techno-managerial turn that this education policy is giving. So we have to mobilize the humanistic, philosophical, and cultural resources, not just Hindu Indic resources, the people's cultural resources, and relate education at every level to the local society, economy, and culture using the constitutional provisions. Only then we can overcome some of the constraints of this education policy.
Yeah. Dr. Alpana Verma has a question to you, sir. So, yeah, please, Alpana.
Thank you, sir, for your talk. First, my question to you is can we say that we are living in the best of the times and the worst? I'm saying this because the systems have completely failed us, as you said. And do you believe that COVID has actually de-skinned the pervasive corruption, not only in the system, but in the mindsets of the common people as well? We have become very complacent with things, be it our environment, be it about our education or everything. So do you think that way that COVID has actually brought into light the pervasive corruption in our society?
Well, I'm glad you are able to see those trends. I do see, Professor Suri does see, many of you do see those trends. But my formulation is the following, that on the one hand, these possibilities have emerged, but the rulers want restoration of the old order. They will talk about the new order. Already, our Prime Minister and the EU leaders are talking about the post-Covet world will be a new world. But that new is their way of restoration. You see, the new in the post-Covid world will be Ayurveda together with allopathy. We are saying, yes, Ayurveda also we need, but it should be part of a people's critical knowledge system. You see, that looks at all knowledge critically and gives confidence to the local people. So whether it is scientists or pundits, nobody is above criticism. They must all be, subjected to rational inquiry. Similarly, EU is talking about a new union with new kind of economy, which is bringing to the shore some production in the continent and a new value chain. Trump is also talking about reducing offshore, bringing the production back to US, and of course India is talking about. Much of India is now hearing the slogan of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Okay. Now, all these terms will become hypocritical if we don't realize that we already are interconnected globally. So, assuming that we are interconnected, how we give power to the local people to negotiate with the rest of the world, rest of India and the world, that yes, on these terms we can have exchange. We can have fair exchange. You take my knowledge, my products. I take your knowledge, your products on these terms, so that both of us benefit. And so COVID creates new possibilities, exposes the old order, but the rulers want restorative order. They all are talking about recovery of the growth rate, 10% shrinking of American economy, 12% shrinking of the European economy. The Chinese, for the first time, the Prime Minister did not announce the growth rate, even a negative growth rate or a positive growth rate in his political work report of the government, and so on. So we are still preoccupied with how to restore the growth, and the monopolists will come together. Already, the big Western monopolists are coming to India as partners. Okay, and we are going abroad as our great monopolists are going abroad as partners. So they have a different agenda. So for them, post-COVID world is opportunities for them. But objectively speaking, we have to see both these kinds of trends. And that is why the intensified contradiction, intensified struggle over democratic possibilities and hegemonic possibilities. That is the unfolding scenario as I can see it.
Thank you, sir. So, do anybody have other questions?
Hello.
Hello, yeah, Jitendra Panda, yeah. So, yeah, can you pose a brief question? Yeah.
Sir, with the approval of a new education policy, MPhil to be discontinued. Sir, what is your opinion? It must be included in your academy, or it is a waste of time?
I was a critic of MPhil from day one. I remember when it came, because one of Delhi University's then Professor Nurul Hassan, who was also education minister, said that, look, if such a big workforce comes to the market, where are the jobs? Let us expand the educational length, years of education. And I remember Professor R.S. Sharma, my neighbor in Delhi University campus, in the morning walk, he said, अब तक PhD बेकारी था, अभी MPhil PhD दोनों बेकारी हो गए. You see, because those who did not become lecturers immediately after MA, they had joined PhD in those days. You see, and those of us who have been part of the Western system for their PhD, etc., we know after BA they go for PhD. MA is a terminal, is a part of the PhD degree. In Oxford, Cambridge, MLit, not MPhil. MLit is given to those who do not qualify for PhD. They are given this as a concessional degree. Or some others who have a limited period scholarship or something, they may choose to do that. You see? Therefore, MPhil was an artificial degree, and to legitimatize it, UGC made it, compulsory for lecturership, this, that, and that. Therefore, I'm glad MPhil has gone, and PhD should be a very specific, 3 to 5 year work, and not more than that. And therefore, that is a welcome development. I think we should welcome.
Thank you, sir. So, if nobody have questions, may I ask the head, Professor Swan, to say something, sir?
Okay, thank you, Professor Mohanty, for such an illuminating presentation and throwing light on the diverse perspective from which we can possibly make sense of the emerging fault line in world politics at large, and also look at how this might have implications both at the national as well as the state or public local level. I think the points are quite plausible, and I think he made very compelling cases of how the post-COVID global order might have implication on the idea of class divide, or the kind of class relation that emerged, and the kind of publicness which is now being now being the norm in this scenario, and also look at how we might possibly have a turn to more centralization and authoritarianism as a result of certain administrative as well as political structure, which is leveraged by rulers or the ruling elite at national, at state, as well as at the global level. I think this is well taken, and I think one of the issues that I think have important bearings on the idea of publicness and the idea of democracy, which tends to turn towards authoritarianism, or for that matter, because of the impetus to centralization that COVID unleashed, is how might we then look at the constitutive conditions of publicness, right? So I think what has been silenced as a result of the post-COVID political situation that emerged in India, for example, is how it leveraged the ruling establishment to silence a certain assertive voice of the Muslims or the marginalized communities in terms of redefining the terms of their inclusion as stakeholders in the polity. I think somehow, somewhere, I think COVID, consciously or unconsciously has given impetus to a pattern of centralization, which further give impetus to the silencing of this dissenting voice, which I think are constitutive of redefining a particular idea or form of publicness, which are, I think, critical for evolving an inclusive, egalitarian, democratic societies. I think the onus is on the idea or the norms, the culture of publicness that we have as academia, to constantly engage ourselves in in critiquing or constructively engaging the kind of monological discourse that has been circulated, superimposed in a monological fashion. And I think that is precisely where our relevance remains. And I think in a continual engagement and critique with the pattern of discourse, the kind of culture which a particular form of governance or particular form of political decision-making structure perpetuate, I think the relevance of academia is increasing more traction. I think to that extent, webinars such as this are very critical in shaping up the kind of democratic space, the kind of the idea and norms of publicness that we might envision for the future. I think in throwing very significant lights on some of these important dynamics of class, of publicness, of democracy, of the tendency towards centralization and authoritarianism, Professor Mohanty and the kind of questions and discussions that is being generated here make very valuable contribution to the way we might think and possibly engage with our futures. Thank you once again, for all of us, for your very active engagement. We want to thank Professor Mohanty for his enlightening presentations and for provoking us to think beyond our narrow confines, possibly think about a more inclusionary, more participatory space, democratic institutions. We'd also like to thank Dr. Zebin Jacob, who has made very important engagement with the ideas and issues raised by Professor Mohanty. I would also like to thank Dr. Beam for coordinating this very important webinar. We'd also like to thank Professor Manjari. In fact, she was hesitant to preside today's for certain protocols that she has always been very gentle and kind, that she does not want to transgress into particular border which finds rightfully belongs to mine, because I have just taken over as the head, which I still thought that since she was the force behind this webinar, she should preside this seminar. But notwithstanding that, we are grateful to her for her contribution to the department. And we also thank colleagues, fellow colleagues from the department, Professor Suri and Kailas, Neha, and others, as well as faculty colleagues from sociology, from different universities, PhD scholars, not only from our university, from Orissa, from other places, to have participated and to lend meanings and enrich the ideas and issues which are raised in this webinar. We hope to carry forward this form of dialogue in the future. In fact, we are in fact thinking about organizing similar lines of webinar on how federalism engage or respond to the challenge that COVID throws up. We would possibly be organizing this sometime in September, October, and we look forward to having more academic engagement and dialogue in the process. We always welcome your active involvement as well as participation in the future as well. Thank you so much once again. With this note, we conclude the session today, and Professor Mohanty, please coordinate with BEAM so that we can give you some sort of token compensation for your very enlightening presentation. So we'd be happy to do
Thank
that.
you. It was a pleasure meeting all of you.
Yeah,
On
thank you so much.
the questions were excellent. Thank you, Professor Suri, particularly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you once again to everybody, sir. Thank you.